Well, I'm officially caught up on the Dresden Files, and as we wait for the next two books to be released later this year, Peace Talks and Battleground, I, as a caught-up reader, can jump on into the wider variety of Dresden Files videos I could make, and we're going to go ahead and kick that off with a spoiler-free, before you read the Dresden Files. Essentially a, should you read it, should you not, depending on how you react to these facts about the series I list off here. But first things first, let's just go ahead and jump into the setting of the Dresden Files. The Dresden Files starts off with the first book, Stormfront, taking place in modern-day Chicago. Well, 20 years old Chicago. The series has been around for 20 years and follows the timeline as it's been stated. The only difference is, in the world Jim Butcher is crafting, supernatural forces walk amongst us. Mr. Butcher pulls from countless mythologies and superstitions from across human history, throws them into a pot with a healthy dash of creative juices and imagination, and the end result is arguably the best realized supernatural version of Earth ever put to page, after you get about 10 books in. The Dresden Files will have the reader journeying alongside our badass cast as they battle various interpretations of vampires, skinwalkers, ghost ghouls, goblins, fae, mist fiends, centaurs, etc., etc. Basically, if you have heard of a mythical creature, it exists here. Even Bigfoot is apparently a pretty cool dude. While the larger focus of the narrative often does trend towards the fae in general, as well as vampires, it seems no bump in the night within the Dresden world lacks a spooky monster behind it, obscure in origin or not to today's supernatural obsessed society. So, if all of these elements are a reality within the Dresden Files, how do humans cope with it all? Flat out, powerful denial, baby. While some people inevitably have to face the horrific reality of the situation humanity exists in, most walk about ignoring the creepy things that go bump in the night, keeping their proverbial heads in the dirt. Well, what if one of the supernatural creatures starts interfering with the mortal world? Generally, the intelligent beings within the supernatural spectrum keep their contact with humans to a minimum. Humans themselves bring their own spoilery, I can't get into it because of, reasons, dangers to that fight. Therefore, most supernatural beings will keep their contact to a minimum. So while vampires still hunt, in large, your average human will never be in direct contact with the darker shades of this world. Basically, scarcity combined with denial and a bit of fear prevents mass hysteria. Well, what if one creature or supernatural practitioner steps out of line? What if they take a giant step specifically in the city of Chicago? That's where our boy Harry Dresden comes swinging in hard. A wizard using the guise as a detective to keep an eye on the supernatural world, Harry Dresden undeniably has a heart of gold. He unfortunately also has a very hot head. He patrols the streets with a staff and gun in hand, believing a fireball can solve just about any problem. This is not a wizard in the same sense as Gandalf. Mr. Butcher has made it clear his philosophy behind writing Harry Dresden was he wanted to see a wizard who actually put their magic to use, and I'll be damned if he didn't achieve that goal. Dresden casts spells, baby. So Dresden does make a rather not lucrative living working as a wizard detective. He receives cold calls from individuals who may have accidentally had a run-in with the supernatural spectrum and can't exactly explain to the police what they're dealing with. Therefore, they look up Dresden in the phone book. He also occasionally can be handed cases from Chicago PD's Special Investigations Unit, headed up by Karen Murphy, his colleague and friend. And while she's not necessarily a believer, she's at least willing to put her trust into Dresden to consult on cases that seem to go beyond what the Chicago PD is willing to accept. Now, if you're a man often called on into dealing with forces outside the understanding of those who called you in the first place, inevitably you'll have detractors, those claiming you were responsible in the first place. Luckily, Dresden does not only walk with a big stick, he also comes with a big mouth. Possessing an extremely active capacity to talk his way out of most situations while providing more insults than three-syllable words, Dresden makes enemies of all kinds. Yes, it's not just the supernatural variety. Dresden also has run-ins with mob bosses who aren't exactly happy with his version of street justice. That's right, Dresden is just as likely to have a gun pulled on him as a claw or magical weapon. Luckily, he may be outnumbered, but he does have allies. Other wizards, paladins, the occasional cop, and even a possessed skull all aid Dresden in trying to keep his ass out of the fire he seems to be constantly stoking. So what exactly should you expect from the Dresden Files beyond the setting and character I have described above? Well, I want to make this absolutely clear if you're one of the people who have seen the show and not read the books. Not the TV show. Cannot stress that enough. Completely remove that from your mind, please. Okay, so the Dresden Files has a serious reputation. Some lump it in with just typical low fantasy, while others, myself included, claim it is the sneakiest epic level fantasy series of all time. While the premise set up here so far in this video seems fairly small scale, the Dresden Files grows. Worlds come to prominence within this story, like the Never Never, and forces well beyond your typical low fantasy faction come into play. On top of that, Dresden's character growth is one of the best fantasy has ever seen, full stop, no question. This is not just coming from me. Here's Rothfuss's opinion on the matter. He has a great review overall, go check it out. Well, Dresden starts very small. That intimacy is used to attach you to a cast of characters who will carry you through with what is, without a doubt, the most expansive low fantasy world I've ever read. So buckle up and prepare for a detective story that may start small, but will rapidly take twists and turns. I promise you, no one calls after just the first few books. And if the scale of the series bothers you, seeing the book in the high teens in count, don't worry, you really can burn through a Dresden book in one slow weekend. Now, it wouldn't be fair if I didn't address some criticisms that the Dresden Files often receives. It's said that the male gaze is very strong within the Dresden Files, and that is absolutely true. I am not going to dismiss that entirely. What I will say is it's the first-person perspective following a wizard who's around supernaturally sexy beings often. And I think that justifies it, especially earlier on, and that kind of gaze does become certainly less substantial towards the latter half of the series. So for me, it fits in the context of the narrative told, but I could see how it would bother others. Some do claim that the series is just too long for them to get into in the first place. I'm going to go ahead and reference you back to the idea that most of these books you really can burn through very quickly, not only because they don't have your typical epic fantasy page count of almost 1,000 pages per book, but they also have a breakneck pace, which pretty much means you're not going to be able to put them down once you start, therefore you'll get through them all pretty quickly. I think my record was 4 Dresden books in 1 week, and that's not really unheard of within the fan base. There is also the criticism of the up-down quality of the books. Another criticism I'm going to agree with, although I will add it trends upwards. The Dresden Files just improves, one after the other, and after you get past one in particular called Dead Beat, I don't think the Dresden Files ever slumps to anything below outstanding in quality again. That's a mixture of just Jim Butcher's overall improved writing and the fact that you're so attached to the characters at this point, they could pretty much just go about an average day walking around Chicago and you would still be fascinated in how they're interacting with each other. The relationships there carry this series in so many ways. So let's go ahead and transition out of the criticisms and dive into the stats of this series. In terms of magic and the importance of the text, 1 out of 10 being there's almost none, 10 out of 10 meaning that magic drives just about every single line of dialogue, I would rate Dresden at a light 9 out of 10. Magic / the supernatural pretty much dominate the pages outside of anything directly character relationship related, and even then, sometimes magic and the supernatural are playing an important role. So for those of you like me who definitely want to be immersed in the magical side of things as much as possible, especially when it's justified to the story, Dresden's going to satisfy that urge. Even the mob bosses inevitably get tied in with the supernatural elements of what Dresden has going on. Now, the parental level for the Dresden Files, I believe, lands at a fairly hard R rating. The horror elements aren't as strong as many other supernatural books, but you can expect loads of nudity, violence, drinking, drug references, death, swearing, profanity, you know, the whole shebang. The Dresden Files does land a solid R within the text itself. I do know that many people think reading these kinds of things are not as bad as watching them in a movie, so I'll leave it up to your own discretion to choose after reading the first book, which is admittedly not as graphic as the series gets. Now, is it grimdark? I would say not at all. The characters are far too good in their hearts, and the good versus evil lines are never blurred so deeply that it could really venture into those grimdark themes. But I would caveat that by saying that Dresden gets darker than many fantasy series would, and I promise you if you push deep enough into the series, you will have tears in your eyes. So who exactly would I recommend the Dresden Files to? Who is the ideal audience? I would say anyone who loves a good character study and development over the better part of a decade, if not more so, and a lot of fun exploring of mythologies and magic, an escalation of stakes from book to book with larger overarching storylines that come to a head many books down the road set up prior. That's actually a very big selling point I like a lot. I really enjoy seeing the hints of things to come that then come to fruition. I really think every reader is going to enjoy that kind of payoff. But the note I actually want to end this video on, and the strongest recommendation I have, is around book 8 of the Dresden Files, I noticed something. The Dresden Files, this silly detective adventure as I first saw it, had successfully gotten under my skin, deeper than almost any other fantasy story I've ever encountered. I felt for Dresden, Karen, Michael, Bob, and the rest of this crew more than I would have ever thought possible when I first got started. So that is the Dresden Files to me. Yes, a story that revolves around a wizard, with the heart being his relationship and development with those around him. Books that you can burn through very quickly. It will make you laugh hard while slowly making you fall in love with the cast of characters unlike any other. So that is the Dresden Files, at least my interpretation after one solid read through, chalking myself to being a very large fan. It was in my top 5 fantasy series of all time, now that I'm caught up. That's a pretty strong recommendation there as well. Let me know what series you'd like to see another one of these before you should reads for in the future in the comments down below. Like and subscribe if you have not already, and hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. Have a good one, y'all. Peace.